Today's daf is daf Mem Dalid, and in order to understand this Gemara, we have to review what we learned in the Mishnah, which records machlokes between Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim as to how you get rid of Avoda Zara. Rabbi Yossi is Mekil. He allows you to grind up the Avoda Zara and scatter it into the wind, despite the fact that it might theoretically be used for the benefit of some Jew that might have a field nearby and it'll fertilize the field. But as we said yesterday, Rabbi Yossi holds Zev Zeh Gorei Mutter, meaning that even in the worst case scenario, that this ground up Avodah Zarah, this idol, was ground up and pulverized, would somehow fertilize the field after he scattered it in the wind and it fell in that field. But nevertheless, the fertilization of the field is a result of two factors. Number one, of this idol that was pulverized, but it's also a result of different elements like soil and water and so forth and so on, and therefore it's not a sole job, and therefore it's not considered benefiting. But the Chacham disagree. So now we start the Gemara, which quotes a brisa that records a dialogue between Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim, in which case Rabbi Yossi is going to try to prove his point from Moshe Rabbeinu and what he did with the golden calf, with the Egel Azav, which was an idol. So Amr Lahem Rabbi Yossi, just on the bottom first of Mem Gimel Amid Beis, Valo Kvar Nemar, with regard to Moshe Rabbeinu, it says, Ve'eschatoschem, there's a pasuk in at the beginning of Chumash Devarim. We won't get to it this Shabbos, Chazon, but rather in a week from now, in Parshas Vayischanon. And it says, Asher sisem es ha'egel, lokachti va'esrof oso ba'esh. So in Mishneh Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu reiterates what he did with the egel, and he burnt it to a fire. And then it says, va'ekos oso tachon heitev adesher dok la'afar. So he pulverized the golden calf, grinding it very well, making it into a fine dust, and presumably he took that dust and he scattered it through the air. The wind would scatter it away. Now, the Torah goes out of its way to teach us where this ground up dust of the egel ended up. It says, El hanachal hayorid min ahar. So it went into a nachal, which is water and it was water that came down from the mountain, and it would seem that Moshe Rabbeinu threw the pulverized dust of the Egel Azav into the wind, and it might have landed somewhere where somebody could benefit from it. So you see that scattering the dust of the Avodah Zarah to the wind is permissible. Amru lo, the Chacham responded, Mishom Raya, the rhetorical question, you prove it from there. It says, now this is a parallel pasuk that appears also in the Chumash, but in this case in Chumash Mos, and it says there, right after the record of the Parshas Kitis of the actual worship of the idol, it says that Moshe Vayizer al Pnei Hamayim, right? He ground up the egas of it to fine powder, and then he scattered it and sprinkled it over the water. And then it says Vayashkes Bnei Yisrael. Now he forced the Jewish people, I don't know exactly how many of them, to drink from this concoction of the dust of the Egel Azov together with water. And what was his point, his purpose? So the Brisa records that lo niskaven el lebodkom kisotos. Moshe Rabbeinu had to determine which of the people of Israel were guilty of actually worshiping the Egel, and therefore they would be put to death for the Avera of Avodah Zarah. And he tested the Bnei Yisrael to see who was guilty and who was not. Just like in the case of a Sota, a married woman who violated the kinui of the Baal, and she was nistar. She went into a private, secluded place with that person. So we check her out by feeding her the concoction of the mechatos, and that's going to be a test to determine whether she's guilty or not. So, in other words, we see that Moshe Rabbeinu was testing the people of Israel and see who would be, destroyed and so forth and so on. But he wasn't afraid at all of the fertilizer business because he really didn't scatter it totally into the wind. In other words, um, most of it he probably used as this powder in order to test the people of Israel, like a sota is tested. Now, there's a commentary called the Torah Chaim who makes a point here that the equation between a sota and avodah zarah is a very profound equation because the infidelity of a sota to her husband, in a case of a Jew who worshipped avodah zarah, that also is like an infidelity of a wife to her husband because of the special relationship between Klal Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, the Gemara in Masechta Yoma, Daf Samach Vav Amid Beis, mentions that there were three categories of participants in the golden calf, and there were three corresponding punishments. One who slaughtered a sacrifice to the golden calf or burned incense to it was punished by the sword. One who embraced or kissed the calf was punished by plague. One who was inwardly happy that the calf was being worshipped was punished with something called a disease hydrogen, which is the swelling of a stomach. Now, to punish the last category of sinners, those who were happy with the fact that there was a joyous occasion, worshiping the idol, Moshe Rabbeinu took the ground up golden calf dust and he concocted with water uh, from the brook, that's mentioned in Nachal, and he gave this potion to the people to drink. Those who are guilty of being happy over the worship of the golden calf would suffer that a third punishment of the swelling of their stomach. So Moshe Rabbeinu, according to the Chachamim of Rabbi Yossi, didn't throw the golden calf power into the wind or cast any of it into running water in a brook, which would have perhaps brought fertilizer to and benefit to people who had fields, but rather he took the water from the brook, into which he sprinkled the entire patch of powder. In other words, according to the Chachamim, there's no proof, as Rabbi Yossi wanted to bring for this incident, that Moshe Rabbeinu scattered the pulverized idol to the wind. No, that's not true, because basically he took the entire batch of powder and sprinkled it into the water of the Nachal. So it ended up in the Nachal, and we're going to soon see that this Nachal was not able to be fertilized, to bring fertilizer. But anyway, Rabbi Yossi held that Moshe Rabbeinu held on to a small portion of the powder because, a majority of the sinners were punished directly by the sword of plague, so he didn't need that much powder in order to punish the third category. Amalehem Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi responds, "Hello." Kfar Nemar, it already says, and now he's quoting a pasuk in Divrei Yomim, V'gam macha aim asa melech hisira mikvira. So macha is a grandmother of Aim Imo of Asa, Melch of King Asa. Asher Asasa miflestes la shera, or la shera mifletes. So what happened was that she made an idol, or shall we be more precise, an Asherah, because the Pasuk calls it an Asherah, and it's called a mifletzes because the word mifletzes sort of is a negative, pejorative term, like a monsters kind of thing. And Asa was very happy about this. He grabbed onto this abomination, this Asherah, vayodek, vayisrof benachal kidron. So it would seem that although her interest was in creating this idol that should be worshipped, or specifically the Asherah, nevertheless, Vayorek, Vay, I think it says Vayodek. The lining here is not good. Vayodek, Vayisro Benachal Kidron. So the ground up dust after they destroyed this Asherah was thrown and scattered into the Kidron Nachal. Right? Nachal is going to bring the water and could fertilize the soil around it. So once again, says Rabbi Yossi, I have another proof that you have to admit that after you grind up the Avodah Zarah, you're allowed to scatter the powder into the wind. The response of the Chachamim was, Mishom Raya, from there you prove it, Nachal Kidron, Eino Megadol Tzmochon. So Nachal Kidron, where the dust ended up, would not possibly produce vegetation. But in an ordinary case, it would be forbidden to scatter the powder of the oil into the wind because every other area would be roy litzmicha and it could be fertilized below. So once again, the Gemara asks Akasha on the Chachamim, are you really correct in assuming that the Kidron Valley does not grow vegetation? Vatanan, we have a Mishnah, or perhaps it's a Brisa, but anyway, it might be a Mishnah in Yoma on Daf Nun Chesamid Beis, Elu ve'elu misarvim bi'amo. Right, there were bloods that were sprinkled on Yom Kippurim on the Mizbeach HaChitzon, right, which is in the Azara, and then there were bloods that were sprinkled in the Mizbeach HaPnimi inside the Kodesh, and these two bloods, when they, after the Hazoyah, if there were remaining bloods, the Shirayim of the bloods would mix together, and they go into an Amma. An Amma is a channel, and that channel would bring the blood out, Yotzal Nachal Kidron, and Imkarim L'Ganonim L'Zevel, Umolim Vahem. So they could be sold to gardeners for fertilizer, and if you use them without first being poda them to the Bedek HaBayis, then you violate the Isur Ve'ila. In any event, it seems like the gardeners would be able to purchase through a pigeon this dam, these combination of these two damim, for the purpose of fertilizer. And that certainly proves that the Yotzim L'Nachal Kidron mentioned in that Mishnah, that Nachal Kidron is capable of producing vegetation, and therefore they fertilized it. And the Gemara says, Makomos Yeshbo. There are different areas in the valley of Kidron, the Nachal Kidron. Yesh Makom Megadol Tzmoch, Yesh Makom She'ein Megadol Tzmoch. So again, when they were scattering the dust of Avodah Zarah into Nachal Kidron, that was in an area that doesn't grow vegetation. There was no chashash that someone would be nene from the Avodah Zarah. But when it says in the Mishnah regarding the bloods in Masech Yoma, that was the part of Nachal Kidron where it was royal tzmicha. And therefore there was me'ilah, and they have to be poded in order to enjoy it as a fertilizer. My miflatzta, what is the meaning of the word miflatzta? Amar Rabbi Yehuda dahavi mafli leitzanusa. In other words, her, right, I think it's the grandmother of Macha, of Asa Melech. They were making sort of like fun of her. And the word mafli means something extreme. And miflotza means depravity, and it's extreme depravity. Her association with the idol was an extreme depravity. So again, this is another example of where we try to denigrate Avoda Zara. Kinitani Rabbi Yosef, Kimin Zachrus Osala. What was the level of her depravity? She put an imitation of a male human organ, attached it to this idol, and every day she would bring this idol into our body and have like an intercourse with this phallus, with this fake penis. And that's her level of depravity. Omelem Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi said to the Chachamim, Halo kvar nemar. And now we get to Melech Chizkiyo. Now, the story of Melech Chizkiyo is that when the people of Israel in the Midbar were bitten by snakes, very dangerous serpents, so Moshe Rabbeinu put up a Nachash Anachoshes and told the people that they should look and focus on this Nachash, on this serpent, this imitation image serpent, and they would be healed. Now, in the course of time, Moshe Rabbeinu had made sure that they would keep this Nachash HaNachoshes as a memory device to remember the great miracle of the Nachash HaNachoshes. But over the course of time, quite tragically, the people started worshiping it, thinking it was an idol. So what did Chizkiyahu HaMelech do when he was afraid that people would continue to worship this Nachash HaNachoshes? He ground it up and turned it into dust. And apparently, once he pulverized it and turned it into dust, he would spread the dust to the wind. The Chacham rejected this proof. Make this image of a serpent. And it says the word lecha mishalcha. The ein adam oser davar she'eino shelo. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu had to go into his own account, take out money, and purchase the raw materials that were needed to create this Nachash HaNachoshes, so that Moshe Rabbeinu was the sole owner legally of the Nachash HaNachoshes, and therefore if another Jew would worship that Nachash HaNachoshes, we apply the principle of Ein Adam Oser Davar She'eino Shelo. I can't generate a prohibition on something that belongs to you. And therefore, Chizkiyahu HaMelech really, according to strict letter of the law, had no rhyme or reason to burn the Nachash HaNachoshes. I mean, it's the private property of Moshe. I guess it was inherited by his heirs. And Hasa b'dinu d'kituse lo avitzarech. In other words, there was no Isra Avodah Zara in the Nachash. Even if the Jewish people would worship it, Ein Adam Oser Davar She'eino Shelo. Ella, but why did he take that initiative and pulverize the Nachash HaNachoshes? Came on the Chazah the Kato Yisrael Basrei Omad v'Kitisol. So he took that initiative, and Chizkiyahu HaMelech destroyed the Nachash HaNachoshes. It could be possible, asks Tosfos, that after he pulverized this serpent, maybe he cast the powder into the Dead Sea, and then this would not be a riot to Rabbi Yossi because there was no possibility of fertilizing any field. But anyway, Tosfos says that from the way that the Torah describes the way that Chizkiyahu HaMelech disposed of the Nachash HaNachoshes, it seems that there were indications that he scattered the powder into the wind. Now, since those who worshipped the serpent were not legally capable of creating an Isra Avodah Zarah because they didn't own it, so they didn't have the legal power to designate it as an idol, and therefore there was no Isra Hana. But because the serpent remained permitted, then over the course of time, people started worshipping it. And in order to avoid that takala, Chizkiyahu took the initiative and decided to to pulverize it. Amalehem. We're still learning this brisa in which Rabbi Yossi constantly barrages a proof and raises an objection. Now we learn a parsha in Shmuel Beis, and this has to do with the battle of David HaMelech and his armies against the Plishtim. And the pasuk is going to tell us that the Plishtim ran away from the field as David was running after them. They left behind them their idols. Now there's going to be a contradiction in Psukim exactly what David HaMelech did with their idols. One pasuk says, "Vayazvu shomes atzabem, vayisaem David v'anoshav." So the pasuk uses the word vayisaem. We'll see what that word means to describe what David HaMelech and his men did with these idols that the Plishtim left behind them as they ran away. And Rabbi Yossi understands that my mashma dahai vayisem David lishna dezeruzehu. According to Rabbi Yossi, the word vayisaem means that he scattered them to the wind, which means that first he pulverized these idols and then he scattered them to the wind. Kidamitargim Rabbi Yosef, and we indeed find the translation of Rabbi Yosef in the next pasuk, where it says, oh, I'm sorry, not the next pasuk. This is a pasuk in Yeshaya, and it's going to prove what the word tisa'em means. Tizreim v'ruach tisa'em. U'mitagaminon tizri'un v'ruach tetatlinun. So it means you scatter them to the wind, and the wind will carry them off. So we know what Vayisa'em means, that David HaMelech took these idols that were left behind by the Plishtim and pulverized them into dust, and then he scattered them to the wind. Amru lo, the Chacham respond misham raya. What about another pasuk? Varehu Omer. The pasuk says, Vayisarfo ba'esh. Vayisarfu ba'esh. Again, a pasuk in Divrei Yomim, it says, "Vayazvu shomes Eloheim, vayomru David, vayomer David, vayisarfu ba'esh." The Plishtim left behind their gods. David gave the command that they were burned in the fire. So, if they were burned in the fire, then it wasn't pshat that that he pulverized the idols and then scattered their dust into the wind. Now, here's what the Rabbanan analyze. Umidaloksiv, it doesn't say vayisarfem, vayisaem, meaning the pasuk should have said that he burnt them and then he scattered the dust from the burning of the idols. Instead, there's a steer between two psukim. One pasuk speaks of David HaMelech burning it. Apparently, he just burnt it, and that was it. And another, the pasuk says vayisaem. And what does that mean? Vayisaem shmami no vayisaem mamish. So vayisaem means to lift something, a masa, and carry it away. So how do we reconcile these two? Either David HaMelech burnt the idols of the Plishtim to a crisp, or the people of David HaMelech carried away the idols to use them for their own benefit. So therefore, kashu kroya dodi. So we have a steer between the two psukim, and the Gemara answers to Rav Huna. The Rav Huna Rami ksiv. We have a steer. It says vayomer David vayisarfu ba'esh. They burnt it. Uksiv vayisaem, which means that David HaMelech's people carried it away. Lo kasha. Kan kodem sheba itai hagiti, and kan liacha sheba itai hagiti. Itai hagiti was a Flishti, a Palestinian, a guy who was captured by David's armies, and over the course of time, he rejected the Plishtim and became a helper to the Jewish people. He was the Huckabee of his time. So what did he do? David HaMelech asked Itai Hagiti to be Mavatal Avoda Zara, right? A guy could be Mavatal another guy's Avoda Zara. And therefore, before David HaMelech got a chance to request of Itai that he be Mavatal the Avoda Zara, at that point it was Avoda Zara Mamish, David burnt it up. But there were still idols that were extant, and now David Melech gets a hold of Itai, and he requests of him to be vatal that, and that's what the people carried away, and they benefited from. T'chsiv, vayikach es ateres malka me'al rosho, u'mishkalo kikar zahav. So apparently, one of the great idols, which is called the king, that apparently they worshipped him. In any event, we're not sure, but in any event, they took off his gold crown and they gave it to David, and David put it on his head. So the Gemara assumes Ishari, Isuri Anoninhu. After all, if they worship the king and the crown that he was wearing, then the crown has the status of Tashmish Avoda Zara, and how could David Melech wear that crown and benefit from that Avoda Zara? Rav Nachman, Itai Agiti Bo Bitla. Itai Agiti came along and he was mevatel it. It lost its status of Avoda Zara. It's now mutabanon. David wore it. Mishkalok Kikar Zav. It weighed a talent of gold, which, according to the art school, is about 70 pounds. So how could he have worn something that weighs 70 pounds on his head? Hechi Motzi Manachlo. Rabbi Yehuda Amarav Ru'il Anuach Al Rosh David. It doesn't mean that the pasuk should be taken literally that David Melech wore this crown. It would be impossible physically for David to wear this crown, but it was roy. It was fit to rest on David's head. That means that you usually something that you wear, I can't wear, and vice versa, meaning it has to fit everyone's individual head. But the miracle was that this crown could fit David's head, even though it was the crown of the king of Ammon, which David conquered Ammon, and he took that crown. Rabbi Yosef Ruchini Omar, Even Shoeves Haisa Ba. Oh, there was a great miracle. And what happened was, as soon as David would sit down in his throne, this magnet would pick up the crown that weighed 70 pounds and put it over his head. It was hovering over his head. David's Doral, but it was elevated above his head, so it wasn't the weight coming down on his head. Reb Lazar Omer, Evan Yikara Haisa Bash is Shavakika. So what the pasuk means is that in this crown there was one stone that was a very precious stone, and it was valued at the talent of a gold, but it wasn't really a crown made of gold that weighed down David's head, so he wore it on his head. Now, the Gemara goes into a digression here about this crown of David HaMelech, and says, Zos haisali ki pikudecha natsarti. So the pasuk says in Tehillim, David HaMelech says that this I had because I guarded your precepts, meaning this miracle that I could wear this crown was granted to me as a reward for the fact that I am very dedicated to your mitzvos. Okay, this I think is a pasuk I'm going to be saying in a few minutes at my mother's graveside. Micah Omar, what is David saying? Hachik Omar, Bischar, as reward for observing your precepts, Shepikudecha Ratzarti, Zos Haisalili Edus, this crown and the miracle of wearing the crown is a testimony that I was totally loyal to observe your precepts. My Edusa, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Shahaya Menicha b'Mokum Tefillin ve'Holam To. That he was able to place it on his head, right where the tefillin go, and it fit him. And that's a great miracle because normally, as we said before, a crown would conform to its in other words, a crown had the dimensions of the head that wore it, but here the crown would somehow miraculously conform to the dimensions of David HaMelech's head. And even though the crown was perfectly round, whereas a person's head is not perfectly round, nevertheless the crown conformed to the shape of David's head, and it sat well on David's head. For boy lanuchi tefillin, how could David HaMelech put this crown at a place where he would normally wear his tefillin shavash? Well, what about the mitzvah tefillin? Omer Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak, Mokum yesh barosh haroy lanichol shtei tefillin. There's enough room on a person's head to place two pairs of tefillin, and therefore he could wear the tefillin and at the same time wear this crown. Vayotziu es ben hamelech vayitnu alav es hanezer v'sa'ed. So, there were a number of sons of David Melech that were rebellious against. I mean, the most famous one was Avshalom, but now we're not talking about Avshalom. We are talking about Yoash. Just one second. All right. I don't know if we have time to go through the entire history here, but in any event, leaving out Yoash, for example, there was Adonio ben Chagis. So David HaMelech was married amongst the various women he was married to a woman named Chagis, and they had a son by the name of Adoniyahu. And when David was old and feeble, Adoniyahu attempted to block Shlomo Melech's ascension to the throne, and he claimed the throne for himself. And he placed the Nezer upon him. Nezer zu klila. This was the crown that they had taken from the Melech of Ammon. And Omer Rabbi Yehuda Marav, Edus hu lebeis David, shekol roy lemalchus holam tov, v'kol she'edo roy lemalchus ein olam tov. So the crown didn't fit the head of Adonio, and that proved that he wasn't really royal Malchus. He was not worthy of inheriting the kingship. Adonio ben Chagis, misnase lemar ani emloch. He says, I'm going to reign. Omer Rabbi Yehuda Marav shemisnase laholmo v'lo halamto. Misnase means, he sort of boasted, exalted himself, and he said, well, I'm going to wear the crown. But when he put on the crown, it didn't fit his head. Vayaslo rechev uparoshim, and now the pasuk describes who were the followers of Adonio in this rebellion against David, and they had chariots and horsemen. V'chamishim ish rotzim b'fanav, and they had 50 runners that would run in front of the chariots. My Rabusai, what's the big chiddush here about the 50 runners? Tana, we learned in the Brisa, kulam netulei tchol v'chakuke kapos haraglayim hoy. In those days, the runners used to run barefoot because the shoes would slow them down. But when you run barefoot through the woods and so forth, it's very dangerous for the foot. So what they did was they carved out part of the soles of their feet. It's mamish disgusting. And what the skin that replaced the sole of the foot was not sensitive to the thorns and so forth and so on. And therefore, now, apparently, an active spleen makes a person sluggish. So the runners destroyed their spleens. You could live without a spleen. And they took certain drugs, and that would improve their performance. Okay, now we get up to the Mishnah on Amud Beis.